What is a myth that is completely incorrect but still accepted? Story 1, the Flat Earth medieval myth, is itself a myth, which is the specific kind of irony that makes it worth examining carefully. The educated medieval world did not believe the Earth was flat. They had not believed it for a very long time. The ancient Greeks had known the Earth was round since at least the 4th century BC, and Eratosthenes had calculated its circumference with reasonable accuracy around 240 BCE. This knowledge was preserved, transmitted, and taught throughout the medieval period. Medieval scholars didn't just accept the round Earth as a received fact, they engaged with it scientifically. Roger Bacon wrote about the spherical Earth in the 13th century. Thomas Aquinas built it into his natural philosophy. Dante's Divine Comedy, one of the most widely read works of the medieval period, is organized around a spherical Earth cosmology. The universities of medieval Europe taught Ptolemaic astronomy, which is explicitly geocentric and spherical. The myth that medieval Europeans believed in a flat Earth was largely manufactured in the 19th century. Washington Irving's 1828 biography of Christopher Columbus, a historical novel, not a scholarly work, invented the dramatic scene of Columbus arguing before Spanish scholars who insisted the Earth was flat and ships would fall off the edge. This didn't happen. The Spanish scholars' actual objection was that Columbus had underestimated the Earth's circumference, which was a valid scientific criticism. He had. The 19th century had specific reasons to paint the medieval period as an age of ignorance. Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinkers wanted a contrast for the scientific progress they were celebrating. The flat Earth believing medieval peasant served as a useful rhetorical foil. The medieval peasant, for their part, probably didn't spend much time thinking about the shape of the Earth either way. The scholars knew it was round. The myth that they didn't was invented centuries after they were dead and unable to object. Story 2, the horned helmet, is the most universally recognized symbol of the Vikings, appearing on sports mascots, Halloween costumes, brewery logos, and tourist merchandise across Scandinavia and the wider world. It is also almost entirely fictional, and its origin is specific enough to be named. Archaeological evidence for Viking-era helmets is actually quite sparse. Only one complete Viking helmet has ever been found, discovered in a Norwegian farm burial in 1943. It is the Geirmundbu helmet, a rounded iron cap with a nose guard. No horns. Horned helmets have been found in Scandinavia from the Bronze Age, thousands of years before the Viking era, used in what appear to be ritual contexts. They were not Viking battle gear. You cannot effectively fight in a helmet with horns. They catch on weapons and become a liability. The horned Viking became a visual standard through a specific series of 19th century cultural productions. Swedish artist Gustav Malmström illustrated a 1820 poem collection with horned helmets on Norse figures. Most influentially, costume designer Carl Emil Doppler created horned helmets for the original 1876 production of Wagner's Ring Cycle, the Norse mythology-derived opera cycle that became a defining cultural event across Europe. The horned helmet spread from opera costume design into popular imagery of the Norse world. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the horned Viking was embedded in advertising, illustration, and nationalist Scandinavian imagery. Once it was in, it was in. The actual Viking warrior wore a simple iron cap, often with a mailcoif. He was formidable for many reasons. The shape of his headgear was not one of them. Story 3, when people picture the Salem witch trials of 1692, they typically picture fire. Burning at the stake is the iconic image of witch execution in popular culture. It appears in films, illustrations, Halloween decorations, and common references to Salem. The burning didn't happen. Not once. Not to any of the people executed at Salem. The actual execution method used at Salem was hanging. All 19 people executed in the Salem witch trials were hanged at Proctor's Ledge, which was identified as the execution site by historians in 2016. The one partial exception is Giles Corey, who was not hanged but was pressed to death by heavy stones, a form of torture called pene forte e dure, applied when he refused to enter a plea. He did not cooperate with the process and died under the stones over 2 days. The confusion with burning is partly understandable as a result of how witch trials operated in other places and times. Burning at the stake was the execution method used in many continental European witch trials and is documented extensively in European legal and ecclesiastical records. In Scotland, convicted witches were typically strangled and then burned. The visual of witch burning has legitimate historical roots in European context. In the specific American colonial context of Salem in 1692, the legal framework was English common law, which prescribed hanging rather than burning for capital offenses. The accused were tried, convicted, and executed according to the legal procedures of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The image of burning Salem witches has been persistent enough to shape collective historical memory in ways that the actual historical record doesn't support. The people who died at Salem were real. The specific way they died is established and documented. The fire didn't happen. Story 4, Let Them Eat Cake, or more accurately, Qu'ils mangent de la brioche, is the most famous thing Marie Antoinette never said. It is attached to her name so thoroughly that her identity in popular memory is largely organized around it, the callous queen, indifferent to the hunger of her people, suggesting they upgrade their bread variety as they starve. The quote is used as shorthand for aristocratic disconnection from suffering. The queen almost certainly never said it. The specific source that makes this clear is Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written around 1765 and published posthumously. Rousseau records a story about a great princess who, upon being told the peasants had no bread, replied, "Let them eat brioche." The attribution is vague. Rousseau doesn't name the princess, and the anecdote has the character of a circulating courtly story rather than a reported specific incident. Marie Antoinette arrived at Versailles in 1770, 5 years after Rousseau wrote this passage. The phrase predates her time at court. Some historians have suggested the great princess in Rousseau's anecdote was Marie Therese, wife of Louis Sif, a figure from a generation earlier. Others suggest it was simply a conventional story about aristocratic obliviousness that Rousseau used without particular attribution. The attribution to Marie Antoinette doesn't appear in the historical record until significantly later, when the Revolutionary period provided strong motivations to attach every symbol of royal indifference to the queen, who was already a symbol. Marie Antoinette was, by most historical accounts, genuinely concerned about the poor and made documented charitable contributions. Whether she was an adequate queen for the political moment is a separate question. The specific quote that defines her popular image was probably borrowed from a story that had nothing to do with her. Story 5, The Medieval Chastity Belt, an iron device locked over a woman's pelvis to prevent intercourse, supposedly worn by crusaders' wives while their husbands were away at war, is a staple of popular historical imagination and the premise of a great deal of medieval-themed humor. It is almost certainly not a real medieval practice. The specific historical problem, the chastity belts that appear in museum collections and historical surveys, are, according to the current scholarly consensus, not medieval. Most of them appear to be 18th and 19th century fabrications, assembled either as curiosities, satirical objects, or deliberate fakes created for the growing market in historical artifacts that developed alongside Victorian-era interest in the medieval past. The British Museum, which held chastity belts in its collection for decades and displayed them as medieval artifacts, re-examined them and concluded they were post-medieval fabrications. The Cluny Museum in Paris similarly reassessed pieces previously described as medieval. Art historian Albrecht Claassen, who wrote a comprehensive study of chastity belts in 2007, concluded that while chastity belts are mentioned in medieval literary texts, sometimes satirically, sometimes in contexts that might be literary fantasy rather than practical description, the surviving physical objects are not genuine medieval devices. The idea of the chastity belt as a practical medieval object runs into practical problems even without the archaeological reassessment. The devices would have been medically dangerous over any extended period of wear, requiring regular removal for basic hygiene. The image of a knight locking up his wife and riding off for years without any provision for this doesn't hold up. The myth proved remarkably durable specifically because it was too good, too evocative, too useful for both serious condemnation of medieval attitudes toward women and comedic purposes to interrogate carefully. Story 6: The Iron Maiden of Nuremberg. The iron cabinet in the shape of a woman, lined with spikes on the interior, hinged to close over a person, is one of the most iconic torture devices in Western imagination. It appears in horror films, heavy metal band names, and is shorthand for medieval brutality. It was almost certainly never used as a torture device, and the surviving examples were assembled centuries after the medieval period they supposedly represent. The specific provenance of the most famous Iron Maiden, displayed at Nuremberg and later at various exhibitions across Europe and North America, was investigated by historians and found to be a composite, a hollow figure that had been a reliquary or decorative object, combined with assorted spikes and interior fittings from various unrelated medieval implements, assembled sometime in the 18th or early 19th century to create a sensational exhibit. The motivation for these assemblages is documented in the history of European exhibition culture, as public museums, exhibitions, and early tourist attractions developed in the 18th and 19th centuries. Artifacts that dramatize the violence and barbarism of earlier eras drew large paying audiences. The medieval torture chamber became a standard exhibit. When genuine medieval torture implements were insufficient for the desired dramatic effect, pieces were combined and enhanced. References to Iron Maiden-type devices in medieval records are exceedingly rare and appear in contexts suggesting they were never operational instruments of judicial torture. The documented medieval torture implements, the rack, various restraining devices, implements of physical harm, are well attested in records and artifacts. The spike-lined cabinet that closes over a person is not among them. The Iron Maiden is a 19th century entertainment industry product. Story 7: The All-Black Ninja. Crouching on rooftops, blending into shadow, clad from head to toe in black cloth with only the eyes visible, is one of popular culture's most enduring images of historical Japan. The image is also largely a theatrical invention, and the specific origin of the black costume is documented in Japanese theatrical history rather than in any historical account of ninja operations. In kabuki theater, the traditional Japanese dramatic form that developed from the 17th century onward, stagehands called kuroko, who appeared on stage during performances to adjust props or assist performers conventionally dressed in solid black. The theatrical convention was that black costuming signaled invisible to the audience. The kuroko were present but, by theatrical agreement, not acknowledged as part of the scene. Audiences understood the convention the way modern audiences understand that a spotlight means pay attention here. When ninja characters began appearing in kabuki productions, the popular theatrical genre of jidaigeki that featured samurai and shinobi stories, they were costumed in the same all-black convention that signaled invisibility to a theater-literate audience. The theatrical invisible costume became, through popular cultural transmission, the historical ninja costume. Historical accounts of actual ninja operations, the shinobi who conducted covert missions during Japan's feudal era, describe practitioners wearing the same clothing as their environment, commoners' clothes that allowed movement through markets and roads unnoticed, or clothing appropriate to whatever cover identity was being maintained. The goal of actual covert operation is to look like a normal person in a normal place, not to look like someone who is trying to be invisible. The black outfit that screams stealth operative is the theatrical shorthand, not the operational reality. Story 8: General Winter is the explanation most people reach for when asked why Napoleon's 1812 Russian campaign failed. The French army marched into Russia, winter came, and they froze. The winter was certainly catastrophic. It is not the complete explanation, and treating it as the primary cause obscures how the disaster actually developed. The campaign began in June 1812 with approximately 685,000 soldiers, the largest army assembled in European history to that point. By the time the Grand Arme reached Moscow in September, it had already lost approximately half that number. The Russian summer, not winter, produced much of this attrition. Disease, primarily typhus and dysentery, killed far more soldiers than cold during the advance. The Russian strategy of trading space for time, burning supplies and scorching earth as they retreated, left Napoleon advancing through a landscape stripped of the forage and local provisions that 19th century armies depended on. Moscow itself offered no strategic resolution. Tsar Alexander refused to negotiate. The city burned, set afire by departing Russians rather than captured intact as Napoleon expected. The army waited in the ruins for 6 weeks through the early autumn, consuming the supplies it had carried and finding no replacement. The retreat began in October, before the deep winter cold arrived. The retreat itself was disastrous not primarily because of cold, though temperatures did drop severely in November, but because the route back through already stripped territory offered no food or shelter, while Russian forces and Cossack cavalry attacked the flanks and rear continuously. Discipline collapsed. The army disintegrated. The winter was real and deadly. It was one factor among several, and it operated on an army that had already been substantially destroyed by disease, starvation, and the specific strategic situation Napoleon had created for himself. Story 9. For most of the 20th century, biology classrooms displayed a diagram of the human tongue divided into zones: the tip for sweet, the back for bitter, the sides for sour, and another area for salty. Students drew it in notebooks. It appeared in textbooks. It was one of those facts that seemed too specific and too systematically taught to be wrong. It was wrong. It traces to a single mistranslation. In 1901, German scientist D.P. Honeck published research on the distribution of taste sensitivity across the tongue. Honeck found that different areas of the tongue had slightly different sensitivity thresholds for different tastes, variations that were, in his data, modest and overlapping rather than exclusive zones. His paper was in German. When the paper was translated and summarized for American audiences in the early 20th century, the modest sensitivity gradients became exclusive zones. The nuance that all areas of the tongue respond to all tastes with minor threshold variations was lost. The clean diagram, this zone for sweet, that zone for bitter, was easy to teach and easy to draw. It propagated through the educational system unchecked. Contemporary taste research is clear. Taste receptor cells responding to all 5 basic tastes are distributed across the entire tongue, not in exclusive regional zones. The tip of your tongue can detect bitter compounds. The back of your tongue responds to sweet. The zone map is wrong in a way that is almost absolute. The myth persisted in textbooks into the 1990s, and in some cases beyond, long after the scientific consensus had moved on. The specific mechanism by which a mistranslated 1901 paper became a 20th century pedagogical standard is a small, specific case study in how scientific errors propagate when they're convenient enough to teach. Story 10. The 5 senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, is a framework that traces back to Aristotle and has been transmitted through Western culture for approximately 2,500 years. It is also, as a complete account of human sensory capacity, significantly wrong. The problem is not that Aristotle's 5 senses don't exist. They do. The problem is that treating them as the complete list omits several other distinct sensory systems that are just as real and just as important for functioning in the world. Proprioception is the sense of body position and movement, the sense that tells you where your arms and legs are without looking at them. Close your eyes and touch your nose. That's proprioception. Damage to proprioceptive pathways produces people who cannot coordinate their own bodies without continuous visual feedback. The vestibular sense, housed in the inner ear, provides information about balance and spatial orientation. Disruption of the vestibular system produces vertigo and difficulty maintaining orientation. Thermoception is the detection of temperature. Nociception is the detection of potentially harmful stimuli, the sensory system underlying pain. Interoception covers sensory information about the internal state of the body: hunger, thirst, heart rate, the felt sense of breathing. Some researchers include chronoception, the sense of time, and various aspects of magnetoreception. The five senses framework persists partly because it's culturally entrenched, and partly because the additional senses are less vividly dramatic than sight or hearing. But a person with intact sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, who has lost their proprioceptive sense, faces severe, debilitating difficulties in basic movement and self-coordination. The five senses are approximately 1/3 of what the human body is actually doing. Story 11, the blue vein myth, has specific, understandable origins and is completely false in a way that makes it worth understanding precisely. Human blood is always red, not sometimes red, not red when oxygenated and blue when not, always red. The hemoglobin molecule that carries oxygen in red blood cells is red, whether it's carrying oxygen or not. Oxygenated hemoglobin is bright red, and deoxygenated hemoglobin is a darker, more maroon red. Neither is blue. Why, then, do veins look blue through pale skin? The answer is in the physics of light penetration. Skin is not transparent. It absorbs and scatters light. Different wavelengths of light penetrate skin to different depths and are scattered back differently. Shorter wavelength light tends to scatter near the surface. Longer wavelength light penetrates more deeply before being scattered back. The result is that the red light that would reveal the red blood in deep veins is absorbed before it reaches the surface, while the blue and green light that reflects back from shallower tissue creates the bluish appearance of the skin above a vein. The vein appears blue because of the optical properties of the overlying tissue, not because the blood inside it is blue. If you cut the vein and look directly at the blood, it is red, darker than arterial blood, but unmistakably red. This can be demonstrated. Blood drawn directly from a vein is dark red, not blue, and it is drawn from that vein without the tissue overhead doing its optical work. Surgeons, nurses, and anyone who has had blood drawn has seen this directly. The blue vein myth is taught in some settings as if it were simple biology. It's actually a failure to distinguish between the color of an object and the color of the light reflected from the skin above it. Story 12, old cathedral windows, Gothic, medieval, early modern, are often thicker at the bottom than the top. This observation, combined with the fact that glass technically lacks the long-range crystalline order of a solid, produced a persistent explanation. Glass is actually a very viscous liquid, slowly flowing downward over centuries, and the thick-bottomed windows are evidence of this centuries-long flow. The explanation is wrong in two distinct ways, and both are worth knowing. First, the windows. Old glass-making techniques, particularly the cylinder method and the crown method used before industrial flat glass production, produced glass of inherently uneven thickness. When glaziers installed these panes, they typically put the thicker edge downward, not because glass flows, but because placing the heavier edge at the bottom made the installation more stable, and because the bottom of a window is the portion most likely to experience stress. The thickness variation is a manufacturing artifact, not a flow artifact. Second, the physics. While glass does technically lack the crystalline structure of a conventional solid, it's an amorphous solid, sometimes called a supercooled liquid in older texts. This does not mean it flows at room temperature on any humanly relevant timescale. The viscosity of glass at room temperature is so extraordinarily high that meaningful flow would require not centuries, but geological timescales, millions of years. Glass at room temperature is, for all practical purposes, a rigid solid. It does not flow. The myth appeals because it sounds like a clever scientific secret hidden in everyday objects. It is not. The windows are thick at the bottom because the people who installed them put them that way. Story 13, knuckle cracking causes arthritis. One man cracked only his left knuckles for 60 years to prove it doesn't. The knuckle cracking arthritis myth is one of the more thoroughly tested everyday beliefs in medicine. partly because of the unusual dedication of one particular researcher. Dr. Donald Unger, a Californian physician, spent approximately 60 years cracking the knuckles of his left hand twice daily while leaving his right hand's knuckles uncracked, as a controlled self-experiment specifically designed to test whether his mother's warnings about arthritis were correct. In 2009, at age 83, he published his findings. No arthritis in either hand. No difference between the two. He won the Ig Nobel Prize for Medicine. Unger's self-experiment is charming, but the conventional scientific literature had already established the same finding through less idiosyncratic means. Multiple studies examining the relationship between habitual knuckle cracking and arthritis, joint swelling, or grip strength have found no consistent association. A 1990 study of 300 patients found no higher rate of hand arthritis among habitual knuckle crackers. Various subsequent analyses have confirmed this. What the cracking sound actually is, the noise was long attributed to bubble formation in the synovial fluid of the joint. Real-time memory imaging has subsequently established that the crack corresponds to the formation of a gas-filled cavity in the joint, bubbles of carbon dioxide forming rapidly as the joint space expands under tension. The bubble disappears quickly, which explains why you have to wait before cracking the same knuckle again. Cracking knuckles may reduce grip strength very slightly over decades of habitual practice, but this is a different claim from arthritis and is of minor practical significance. The myth persists because knuckle cracking is mildly socially irritating, and it is more satisfying to prohibit an irritating behavior with a health warning than to simply object to the sound. Story 14, shaving makes hair grow back thicker. The optical illusion that became a medical warning, the belief that shaving causes hair to grow back darker, coarser, or faster, is one of the most widespread personal care misconceptions, and one that has been tested directly and consistently found to be false. It is also one of the easiest myths to understand mechanically once you know what's actually happening. A hair shaft has a naturally tapered tip. The end of an uncut hair is finer and lighter in color than the rest of the shaft, having been exposed to light and friction over time. When you shave, you cut the hair at its widest, darkest, most uniform cross-section. The regrowth then begins from this blunt, dark cross-section rather than from a tapered, lighter tip. The hair feels stubbly and looks darker, not because the hair has changed, but because you're seeing and feeling the base of the shaft rather than the tip. The actual diameter, color, and growth rate of a hair are determined by the follicle beneath the skin surface, which shaving does not affect in any way. A blade cutting the hair shaft above the skin has no mechanical or biological pathway to communicate information to the follicle below the skin, let alone to change that follicle's behavior. This was tested directly in a 1928 clinical study that found no difference in hair growth rate or pigmentation following repeated shaving compared to unshaved control areas. The finding has been reproduced multiple times since. The myth persists because the subjective experience of shaved regrowth genuinely feels and looks different from unshaved hair. The blunt cross-section is noticeably stubbly, and the lack of a tapered tip makes the hair appear darker and coarser. The perception is real. The interpretation of what caused it is wrong. Story 15, you lose most heat through your head. The military study that produced a durable myth to claim that you lose 40 to 45% of your body heat through your head, sometimes expressed as a majority, is stated with confidence in cold weather guidance, winter clothing recommendations, and parenting advice across multiple countries. It is not accurate, and its origin is specific and traceable. In the 1950s, the U.S. Army conducted a cold weather survival study in which subjects were dressed in Arctic military suits and exposed to cold conditions. The suits covered everything except the head. Under those specific conditions, everything insulated except the head. Subjects did lose a disproportionate amount of heat through their exposed heads, simply because it was the largest exposed surface area. The study's finding was then extracted from its context and applied universally. Heads lose more heat than other body parts. The extraction ignored the crucial detail that the finding was an artifact of the experimental setup, not a property of heads specifically. If the same subjects had been wearing hats but bare from the waist down, they would have lost a disproportionate amount of heat from their exposed torsos and legs. The physics of heat loss is straightforward. You lose heat from whatever skin surface is exposed, roughly in proportion to the area exposed and the temperature differential between skin and air. The head, comprising roughly 10% of body surface area, loses roughly 10% of body heat when exposed under typical conditions. It does not disproportionately radiate heat. The practical advice, wear a hat in cold weather, is fine advice. It's good to keep your head warm. The specific reasoning, your head loses more heat than other body parts, is wrong, and it created the additional implication that hats are somehow more important than other insulating layers, which is not the case. Story 16, left brain versus right brain personality types. Neuroscience has not found the two personality types. The left brain, right brain personality framework is one of those ideas that has so thoroughly penetrated popular culture and business training and educational practice that its scientific inadequacy requires some effort to communicate. The framework, your dominant hemisphere, determines your cognitive style. Left brain dominant people are logical, analytical, sequential. Right brain dominant people are creative, intuitive, holistic. You can take a quiz to find out which you are. The framework is not supported by neuroscience. This is not a subtle point that requires reading between the lines of complex studies. It is the direct conclusion of the researchers who study brain lateralization. The left and right hemispheres do have different specializations in some specific functions. Language processing is predominantly left lateralized in right-handed people. Certain aspects of spatial processing have right hemisphere tendencies. These functional asymmetries are real. They do not translate into the personality type framework. A 2013 analysis of fMRI data from more than 1,000 people specifically investigated whether individuals showed consistent patterns of left hemisphere or right hemisphere dominance across their neural networks. The analysis found no evidence of such individual-level brain dominance. Both hemispheres are actively engaged in virtually all cognitive tasks in virtually all people. The brain operates as an integrated system connected by the corpus callosum, not as two systems that different people use in different proportions. The left brain, right brain framework appears to have developed from legitimate early observations about hemispheric specialization, which were then extended and popularized well beyond what the evidence supported, partly because the resulting personality typology was useful for educational and corporate training programs. Whether the typology being useful has any relationship to it being true is a different question. Story 17, learning styles. Teaching to visual/auditory/kinesthetic learners has been in teacher training for decades without evidence it works. The learning styles hypothesis, that students have preferred learning modalities, that these preferences are stable individual differences, and that instruction matched to a student's preferred modality produces better learning outcomes, has been one of the most widely taught concepts in teacher education programs for several decades. Teachers are trained in it. Schools adopt it as a framework. Students are assessed for their learning style and given recommendations based on the result. The hypothesis has consistently failed controlled empirical testing. This is the core problem. It is not that the research on learning styles is mixed or that some studies support it and some don't. The specific prediction that the learning styles hypothesis makes, that visual learners learn more from visual instruction than from verbal instruction, while auditory learners learn more from verbal instruction, has been tested directly, and the predicted interaction has consistently not been found. Psychologists Daniel Willingham, Hal Pashler, and various other cognitive science researchers have reviewed the evidence extensively. Pashler's 2008 review, which directly examined studies designed to test the matching hypothesis, concluded that the evidence base was inadequate to justify the application of learning styles theory in education. What research does support, people have preferences for how they like to receive information. People's ratings of their own learning style preferences are somewhat consistent over time, but having a preference for visual presentation is not the same as learning more effectively from visual presentation. The evidence for the former is fine. The evidence for the latter is not. The learning styles framework remains in teacher training and school practice in many countries despite the evidence, partly because it is intuitive and appealing, and partly because the educational establishment moves slowly in updating its foundational assumptions. Story 18: Antibiotics Cure Colds and Flu. The misuse that created a global crisis. Antibiotics kill bacteria. They do this through specific mechanisms, disrupting bacterial cell wall synthesis, inhibiting bacterial protein production, interfering with bacterial DNA replication. These mechanisms act on features of bacterial biology that viruses don't have. Viruses are not bacteria. Antibiotics have no pathway through which they can affect a virus. The cold and flu are caused by viruses. Antibiotics do not treat them. They have never treated them. They cannot treat them. A person with an influenza infection who takes a course of amoxicillin is taking medication that has no more effect on the influenza virus than a placebo, while exposing the bacteria in their body to the selection pressure that drives antibiotic resistance. This point requires emphasis because it has a consequence that extends well beyond any individual's cold. Antibiotic resistance is one of the most serious global public health challenges currently being addressed, and a significant driver of resistance is the inappropriate use of antibiotics for conditions they cannot treat. When antibiotics are used against viral infections, they don't kill the virus, but they do expose the bacteria in the patient's microbiome and any bacteria they subsequently encounter to antibiotics. Bacteria that happen to have mutations conferring resistance survive. Resistance spreads. The inappropriate prescription of antibiotics for viral respiratory infections has been extensively documented. It happens because patients expect treatment, doctors feel pressure to prescribe, and the cold is going to resolve whether or not antibiotics are given, which creates the false impression that the antibiotic worked. There is almost no condition in which taking antibiotics for a common cold or standard seasonal flu is medically appropriate. The myth that antibiotics treat these infections has contributed to a crisis that threatens to make routine bacterial infections difficult to treat. Story 19: Ostriches bury their heads in sand. The bird that would actually die if it did this. The ostrich head burying myth is among the most ancient and most persistent in the popular bestiaries of the Western world. Pliny the Elder described ostriches hiding their heads in bushes and believing themselves invisible. The image of a large bird burying its head in sand to avoid danger became a metaphor so embedded in language that burying your head in the sand is now a standard idiom for willful ignorance, an idiom based on something an animal never actually does. Ostriches don't bury their heads in sand. They cannot, for a reason that is both obvious and worth stating explicitly. Burying your head in sand would suffocate you. An ostrich that buried its head in sand would be an ostrich that died. Natural selection has not produced birds that suffocate themselves when frightened. What ostriches do that might have inspired the myth? They are ground-nesting birds, and they do lower their heads to the ground to turn eggs, to eat, or to press their long neck flat against the ground in what appears to be a hiding behavior. From a distance, particularly with the light and the distortion of desert heat shimmer, an ostrich pressing its neck and head flat against the ground could appear, to a casual observer, to have its head buried. The shape of the animal changes significantly when it's doing this. Ostrich defensive behavior when threatened is rather different from hiding. They run at up to 45 miles per hour, or they kick with their powerful legs in ways that can cause serious injury to predators. These are not the strategies of an animal that deals with threats by pushing its head into the earth. The metaphor produced by a myth about a fictional bird behavior has outlasted any interest in whether the original bird behavior was real. Story 20: Bats are blind. Every species has functioning eyes, and many see quite well blind, as a bat is a phrase that has embedded itself in English so thoroughly that it functions as a near synonym for visual impairment, invoking the bat as the paradigm case of a sightless animal. All bat species, have eyes. All bat species can see. Many bat species see quite well. The phrase is wrong about bats in the same way it would be wrong to say legless as a dog. The origin of the myth is the confusion between echolocation and blindness. Many bat species do use echolocation, the emission of ultrasonic pulses and the interpretation of their echoes, as their primary navigational sense, particularly for hunting in darkness. This is a remarkable and genuinely impressive sensory capability that operates effectively in complete darkness where vision would be useless. But echolocation is an additional sense, not a replacement for vision. It operates at high frequencies that provide detailed information about nearby obstacles and prey. Vision provides a different kind of information about the environment, particularly over longer distances and in conditions with some ambient light. Most bat species use both, allocating each sense to the tasks it performs best. The megabats, the large fruit bats, flying foxes, and their relatives are generally nocturnal and eat fruit rather than insects, and rely primarily on vision and smell rather than echolocation for finding food. Their visual systems are well developed for low-light conditions. They are not small-eyed, poorly sighted animals navigating by sound. They are large-eyed animals navigating primarily by sight in low-light conditions. Even the microbats that rely heavily on echolocation for insect hunting generally have functioning eyes they use when light is available. The bat is not blind. The saying is wrong. Both persist. Story 21, sharks don't get cancer. The supplement industry invented this and people paid for it the claim that sharks don't get cancer, and the corollary that shark cartilage might therefore be a cancer treatment or preventive for humans generated a substantial commercial industry in the 1990s and 2000s, producing books, supplements, and clinical trials. The foundational premise of the claim is false. Sharks get cancer. The myth appears to have originated or been significantly amplified by a 1992 book called Sharks Don't Get Cancer by I. William Lane, which advocated shark cartilage as a cancer treatment. The book's title made a claim that was not accurate when it was written and became progressively less accurate as subsequent research documented cancer in sharks. Tumors have been documented in sharks across multiple species and multiple tissue types, including cartilaginous tissue. The Smithsonian Institution maintains a registry of shark and ray tumors. By 2013, this registry included several hundred cases of tumors in elasmobranch species, including malignant tumors in cartilage. A 2013 review in the journal Oncology identified multiple documented cases of carcinomas and other malignancies in sharks. The scientific literature on shark cancer did not support the sharks don't get cancer claim even before the modern documentation became extensive. The claim was made, became commercially significant, and the commerce outran any attempt at correction. The specific harm: people with cancer were sold shark cartilage supplements as cancer treatment. Clinical trials of shark cartilage as a cancer therapy found no benefit. The supplements were biologically implausible. Cartilage proteins are digested in the stomach rather than reaching tumors, as well as being based on a false premise. The supplement industry contributed to the overfishing of shark populations while providing no therapeutic benefit. Story 22. Touching a baby bird makes its mother reject it. Most birds barely have a sense of smell the warning against touching baby birds. If you handle it, the mother will smell your scent and abandon it, is one of the most widely transmitted pieces of wildlife advice in English-speaking cultures, passed from parents to children across generations as protective guidance. It is wrong, and the wrongness matters because it causes people to leave injured or distressed birds without help they could provide. Most bird species have very poorly developed senses of smell. Olfaction is simply not a primary sensory modality for the majority of birds, which rely predominantly on vision and hearing. The olfactory bulb, the brain structure responsible for processing smell, is proportionally very small in most bird species. Birds in general lack the sensitive olfactory apparatus that would allow them to detect human scent on their chicks with the reliability the myth requires. Research on parental behavior in various bird species has found that parents do not typically abandon chicks that have been handled by humans. Birds that abandon nests after disturbance are typically doing so in response to persistent disturbance to the nest itself, the presence of a predator threat, rather than to the scent of handling. The advice to leave baby birds alone has some general practical wisdom behind it. Interfering with wildlife unnecessarily is bad practice, and many fallen baby birds are fledglings that are supposed to be on the ground while they complete their development, not birds in distress. These are sensible reasons not to handle wildlife. The specific reason given, maternal rejection due to smell, is not accurate. A baby bird that has genuinely fallen from a nest and cannot be returned can often be returned to the nest. The mother, with her limited olfactory capacity, is unlikely to know you touched it. Story 23, daddy longlegs are dangerously venomous. They have no venom glands and are not even spiders. The daddy longlegs myth is one of the more layered in the popular natural history bestiary because it combines a false identification with a false claim about the falsely identified animal. The creature most commonly called daddy longlegs in North America, the harvestmen, order Opiliones, is not a spider, has no venom glands, produces no venom, and poses no danger to humans whatsoever. The claim that it is extremely venomous but can't bite through human skin is wrong at every step. Harvestmen are arachnids, which makes them relatives of spiders, but they are a distinct order. Unlike spiders, harvestmen have no venom glands, no silk glands, and no ability to produce venom. The fundamental anatomical infrastructure for venom delivery simply isn't present. There is no scenario under which a harvestman could be venomous because it lacks the body parts that venom production and delivery would require. The can't bite through human skin component of the myth adds insult to injury. It provides an explanation for why no one has ever been envenomated by a daddy longlegs while maintaining the exciting claim that the potential is there. The explanation is unnecessary because the animal has no venom. The myth may partly reflect confusion with two other animals also called daddy longlegs in different regions, crane flies and cellar spiders of the genus Fulcus. A 2004 episode of the television show Mythbusters tested this specific claim about Fulcus and found that the venom, when it managed to penetrate human skin in a controlled test, produced only minor, very temporary localized irritation. The harvestman has been falsely convicted of potential lethality it has never possessed. Story 24, dogs see only in black and white. They have color vision similar to red-green color blindness. The black and white dog vision myth has been sufficiently thoroughly debunked by veterinary ophthalmology that it represents an interesting case of a popular belief persisting well after the scientific consensus has clearly moved. Dogs do not see in black and white. They see in color, reduced color, missing specific parts of the spectrum, but color nonetheless. The vision of vertebrate animals is determined largely by the types of photoreceptor cells present in the retina and their spectral sensitivities. Humans have 3 types of cone, giving us trichromatic color vision across a broad spectrum. Dogs have 2 types of cone. They are dichromats. Their cone sensitivities peak at blue and yellow-green wavelengths, providing color discrimination across the blue to yellow spectrum, but with poor discrimination in the red to green range. A dog's vision is roughly comparable to that of a human with red-green color blindness. In practical terms, a dog can distinguish blue from yellow, can tell the difference between a yellow tennis ball and a green one better than was long assumed, and can detect a wide range of colors that fall outside the red-green confusion zone. What they cannot do is distinguish red from green. A red object and a green object may appear similar or identical in hue to a dog. The black and white claim was never well sourced and appears to have accumulated through repetition rather than specific documented origin. By the 1990s, the scientific understanding of canine color vision was established clearly enough that the black and white claim should have receded. It has receded in scientific and veterinary contexts. Popular transmission has been slower. Story 25, the Sahara is the world's largest desert. Antarctica is nearly 3 times the size of the Sahara is the world's largest hot desert. That qualifier, hot, is the one doing essential work, and it is almost always dropped in the popular version of the claim. The full statement is technically true. The shortened version, which is what most people learn and repeat, is wrong. The definition of a desert is a region receiving very low annual precipitation, typically less than 250 mean year per year. The defining characteristic is aridity, not sand, not heat, not large expanses of empty landscape. Under this definition, which is the technical geographic and ecological definition, Antarctica qualifies as a desert, in fact, as the world's largest desert by a substantial margin. Antarctica receives an average of approximately 166 mema of precipitation per year, making it significantly drier than the Sahara, which averages approximately 25 mema per year in the driest regions and somewhat more in others. Both are deserts by precipitation criteria. Antarctica covers approximately 14.2 million square kilometers. The Sahara covers approximately 9.2 million square kilometers. The Antarctic desert is roughly 1.5 times larger. The Arctic, too, qualifies as a polar desert by precipitation criteria, covering approximately 13.9 million square kilometers. The popular conception of desert as sand dunes and scorching heat is a narrow subset of the actual ecological category. The world's largest desert is cold, white, and located at the bottom of the planet, and most people who confidently know that the Sahara is the world's largest desert have never been told there's a larger one. Story 26 Everest is Earth's tallest mountain. By two different measurements, two different mountains win Mount Everest's claim to be the world's tallest mountain depends entirely on how you define tallest, a question that turns out to have at least two distinct, reasonable answers, each of which gives a different winner. The measure by which Everest wins, highest elevation above sea level, is the most commonly used, and Everest's 8,848.86 meters above sea level is genuine and unchallenged. No point on Earth's surface is higher relative to sea level. This is the measure used in most contexts and is the one that matters for mountaineering difficulty, atmospheric conditions, and record keeping. The measure by which Everest loses, height from base to peak, produces a different winner. Earth's surface is not flat. The planet bulges at the equator due to its rotation. This means that a mountain located near the equator is, simply by virtue of its latitude, sitting on a base that is already farther from Earth's center than a base at higher latitudes. Mauna Kea in Hawaii, measured from its base on the ocean floor to its peak, is approximately 10,210 meters tall, greater than Everest's total height from base to peak. By a third measure, distance from Earth's center, Ecuador's Mount Chimborazo wins, because its location near the equator means its summit is approximately 6,384 km from Earth's center, compared to Everest's approximately 6,382 km. Chimborazo is shorter than Everest by sea level elevation, but its summit is farther from the center of the planet. Each of these measures is legitimate. Which one you use depends on what question you're actually asking. Most people learn one without knowing the others exist. Story 27 Chameleons change color to camouflage. The actual reason is mostly social. The camouflage interpretation of chameleon color change is so intuitive that it has been embedded in popular imagination since antiquity. The chameleon as the ultimate camouflage artist, matching its background perfectly. The actual biology of chameleon color change is more interesting and somewhat different from this image. Research on chameleon color change, particularly work by biologist D.V. Stewart Fox and colleagues published in the 2000s, established through systematic observation that chameleons primarily change color in response to social and physiological cues, rather than to match their background. The primary triggers for color change are the presence of rival males, the presence of potential mates, the animal's own temperature, and its stress level. A male chameleon confronting a rival male produces vivid, high-contrast color changes. The most dramatic color displays occur during these competitive encounters, not when the animal is trying to hide. A chameleon communicating submission produces a different palette. A chameleon attempting to attract a female produces yet another pattern. These social displays are the primary function of the color change system. The underlying mechanism, layers of iridophore cells containing tiny crystals that reflect different wavelengths of light depending on their spacing, is not designed for matching specific backgrounds, but for producing specific colors and patterns for specific communicative purposes. Chameleons do have some degree of background matching capacity, and there is some evidence they can modulate their baseline coloration to reduce contrast with their environment. But this is a secondary capacity operating within a system primarily adapted for social signaling, not a dedicated camouflage apparatus. The animal that became a cultural symbol of blending in is primarily a social communicator with a dramatic visual vocabulary. Story 28 Eskimos have 100 words for snow, a linguistic claim that grew with every retelling the claim that Eskimo languages have dozens. Hundreds, or some impressively large number of words for snow, has been repeated so widely in popular culture, business books, and lectures about cultural relativity that it has become a standard example of how language shapes perception of the world. The claim is, in the specific form it usually takes, substantially, a myth. A myth with an interesting genealogy. The origin traces to anthropologist Franz Boas, who in 1911 made a passing observation that Inuit languages had 4 root words for snow compared to English's 1. This was not a careful analysis of snow vocabulary, but an illustrative example and a discussion of how languages categorize experience differently. The number 4 was not especially dramatic. The number grew with each retelling. By the time the claim was being widely cited in the 1980s and 1990s, figures of 50, 100, and more had appeared. Writer Jeffrey Pullum published a famous 1989 essay called The Great Eskimo Vocabulary Hoax, debunking the inflated version of the claim. The linguistic reality is more nuanced than either the myth or the debunking. Inuit languages are polysynthetic. They build long, complex words from smaller components in ways that English doesn't. A concept that English expresses with several words may be expressed in a single Inuit word. This means that counting words for snow depends heavily on where you draw the boundary between a word and a phrase. The number of distinct root concepts for snow-related phenomena isn't dramatically higher than in English. The number of possible compound expressions drawing on those roots is very large by English word-counting standards. The original claim was modest. The retelling made it dramatic. The dramatic version was wrong. Story 29. Frankenstein is the monster's name. The monster has no name. That's actually the point. Frankenstein is the scientist. Victor Frankenstein, the ambitious natural philosopher who creates life in Mary Shelley's 1818 novel, gives his name to the story, but not to his creation. The creature he makes is never named in the novel. It is referred to as the creature, the daemon, the monster, the wretch, but never as Frankenstein. The confusion is understandable given the density of film and cultural adaptations that have attached the scientist's name to the creation, but it inverts the novel's relationship between name and identity. Victor Frankenstein is the character who claims full social recognition. He has a family, a name, a place in the world, a history. The creature is the one denied these things. Part of the novel's moral architecture is that the creature seeks recognition, connection, and a name, and is refused them. The creature's lack of a name is not an oversight. It is one of the novel's central points. The creature explicitly addresses the naming issue in the novel. In his long first-person account of his own experience, he acknowledges that he doesn't know his own name, that he has come to understand himself through reading others' accounts and through his creator's journals, and that his creator refused him the relationship and recognition that would have included a name. The namelessness is part of the creature's exclusion. Popular usage has given the creature the scientist's name, producing the irony that the character who was deliberately denied a name has been given one, the wrong one, by millions of people who haven't read the book. The scientist who created and then abandoned his creation has, as a final indignity, had his name permanently attached to the creature he refused to take responsibility for. Story 30 Roman vomitoriums were for vomiting. They were exit tunnels named for expelling crowds. The word vomitorium evokes a specific and viscerally wrong image of Roman feasting culture. A room adjacent to the banquet hall where guests retreated to empty their stomachs and return for more food. The practice supposedly enabling the legendary Roman excess that contemporary accounts describe. The image is false, and the word means something entirely different. A vomitorium, plural vomitoria, was a passageway in a Roman amphitheater or theater through which the audience entered and exited. The Latin verb vomire, from which the word derives, means to spew forth, and was applied to the function these passageways served, rapidly expelling large crowds from the seating areas into the surrounding space. A large amphitheater, like the Colosseum, had multiple vomitoria arranged around its circumference, allowing the capacity crowd of approximately 50,000 to empty the seating quickly and safely. The architecture was practical and effective. Roman amphitheaters were designed with an understanding of crowd movement that produced efficient egress from large events, a design concern that modern stadium architects study and learn from. The connection to food and vomiting appears to have been manufactured by imaginative later writers applying the word's etymology to a false historical claim. The practice of deliberately purging to eat more, which some Roman texts do describe in ways suggesting it occurred among extreme cases of excess, did not have a dedicated architectural facility. It would have occurred wherever one happened to be. The word describing a crowd management architectural feature became an emblem of Roman decadence through a false etymology applied by people who didn't check what the word actually referred to. Story 31 You must wait 24 hours to report someone missing. This rule has never existed and costs lives. The 24-hour waiting period for missing persons reports is not a law, not a police policy, not a guideline, and not an informal standard in any U.S. law enforcement jurisdiction. It has never existed as an official requirement. Law enforcement agencies explicitly and actively discourage waiting to report a missing person, particularly a child, specifically because the first hours after a disappearance are disproportionately important to the likelihood of a positive outcome. The myth's persistence is genuinely dangerous. People who believe the 24-hour rule exists may wait before reporting a missing person, particularly a child, on the assumption that doing so before the threshold will result in their report being dismissed. This waiting is not required and can significantly reduce the effectiveness of any subsequent search. The origin of the myth is not clearly established. It appears to have accumulated through crime fiction and police procedural television, rather than from any actual law enforcement practice. Television dramas have depicted police declining to take missing persons reports in the first 24 hours as a dramatic device. The fictional depiction entered popular understanding as factual policy. Amber Alert, the nationwide child abduction alert system in the U.S., specifically requires prompt reporting to initiate. The criteria include that a child is believed to have been abducted, which requires law enforcement to have the case before an Amber Alert can be issued. The system is designed on the premise of immediate reporting. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children explicitly states there is no waiting period. The FBI's guidelines for missing persons emphasize immediate reporting. The 24-hour rule is fiction that has been transmitted as fact in a context where the fiction causes specific, preventable harm. Story 32, the 5-second rule. Bacteria don't read clocks, the 5-second rule. The informal guideline that food dropped on the floor and retrieved within 5 seconds is safe to eat because bacteria haven't had time to transfer is not supported by microbiology, and the specific claim it makes about bacterial transfer timing is wrong in its most important assumption. Bacterial transfer from a contaminated surface to food is not a timed process with a threshold. It is a contact process. When food contacts a contaminated surface, bacterial cells that are at the interface begin transferring immediately. The rate of transfer depends on the moisture content of the food, the texture of the surface, and the load of bacteria on the surface, not on how long the contact is maintained past some minimum threshold. Microbiologist Donald Schaffner at Rutgers University studied this directly in research published in 2016. He tested multiple combinations of food type and surface type with timed contact durations from under 1 second to 5 minutes. The finding: bacteria transferred in under 1 second across all food and surface combinations. Longer contact time did increase transfer. More contact meant more bacteria. But the idea of a threshold before which transfer doesn't occur is not what the data showed. Carpet transferred less bacteria than tile or stainless steel for most foods, probably because the food makes less complete contact with the irregular surface. Watermelon transferred far more bacteria than gummy candy because its moisture facilitated transfer. The 5-second rule's underlying premise, that bacteria wait, is false. The bacteria are already moving when the food touches the surface. Story 33, 8 glasses of water a day. A specific number with no specific source, 8 glasses of water a day, or sometimes expressed as 8 8-ounce glasses, the 8x8 rule, is one of the most widely cited pieces of health advice in circulation. It is stated with the confidence of established medical fact. It has no solid scientific foundation. Nutritionist Heinz Valton published a 2002 paper in the American Journal of Physiology specifically attempting to trace the scientific origin of the 8x8 recommendation. He found no clinical evidence supporting the specific figure, no controlled trials establishing it, and no identified source from which the recommendation derived. He suggested it may have originated from a 1945 U.S. Food and Nutrition Board recommendation that stated a suitable allowance of water for adults is 2.5 liters daily, but that the same document's next sentence, noting that most of this quantity was contained in food, was dropped from subsequent citations. Actual hydration requirements vary substantially by body size, physical activity, climate, and the composition of the diet. A sedentary person in a cool climate who eats a diet with significant water content has substantially different hydration needs from a person doing heavy physical labor in a hot environment. A fixed universal number cannot capture this variation. The kidneys are well equipped to handle a range of water intakes and regulate hydration through multiple feedback mechanisms. Most healthy adults with normal kidney function stay adequately hydrated by drinking when they're thirsty. A mechanism evolution has had substantial time to refine. The 8 glasses advice is harmless for most people and counterproductive for a small number with conditions that require careful fluid management. Its authority comes from repetition rather than from any established scientific basis. Story 34, sushi means raw fish. The vinegar rice is the sushi. The fish is optional. Sushi, in Japanese, refers to the vinegared rice, the seasoned, slightly sticky rice preparation that is the defining element of the food category. The word derives from an archaic term referring to the sour flavor of fermented rice. Every preparation called sushi in Japanese cuisine centers on this specific rice. The fish, or other toppings, or other ingredients are what you put with the rice. This distinction matters because sushi in popular English usage has come to function as a synonym for raw fish, which produces multiple misunderstandings. Vegetarian sushi with cucumber, pickled vegetables, or other plant-based ingredients is sushi by definition. Cooked seafood sushi with crab, shrimp, or eel is sushi. Tamago sushi, topped with a sweetened egg omelette, is sushi. All of these are rice with toppings. All of them are sushi. None of them require raw fish. Raw fish served without the vinegared rice is not sushi. It is sashimi, a distinct preparation with its own name, its own serving conventions, and its own cultural history. The conflation of sushi with sashimi in English usage collapses this distinction. The sushi equals raw fish equation creates the additional awkwardness that people who don't eat raw fish sometimes avoid sushi restaurants entirely, assuming there is nothing for them to eat, when the menu may contain multiple preparations with no raw fish at all. The rice is the sushi. The raw fish is optional, traditional in many preparations, and unavoidable in others, but it is not what the word means. Story 35, The Myth About Myths. Why things that are wrong keep feeling true. We've been through 34 myths. Flat-earthed medieval scholars who knew perfectly well the earth was round. Horned Viking helmets invented by an opera costume designer. Salem witches who were hanged. A queen who didn't say the most famous thing attributed to her. A body that stays warm not through its head but through whatever's exposed. A tongue map made from a bad translation. A scientist who cracked his knuckles for 60 years for science. Dogs that see in color. A desert larger than the Sahara that is almost entirely under snow. Every one of these was transmitted confidently, repeatedly, and often by people in teaching and authority roles. Many are still being taught, and every one of them shares a specific quality. They felt true. They fit a pattern people already had. They were the kind of fact that, once heard, seemed obviously correct. The flat earth medieval myth fits the pattern of progress narratives. Previous people were less enlightened than us. The horned Viking fits the pattern of fierce northern warriors. The 24-hour waiting period feels like bureaucracy, which feels like law enforcement. The tongue map was a diagram, and diagrams feel like official science. The specific mechanism by which myths persist is not stupidity or gullibility. It is that myths survive by matching existing patterns. They feel like facts because they feel like what facts should feel like. They feel coherent with other things you already believe. They come from authoritative sources, teachers, parents, textbooks, and are therefore cached without scrutiny. The correction that makes a myth retreat is usually less vivid than the original claim, harder to remember, and less satisfying narratively. Here's the complicated real story rarely sticks, as well as here's the clean myth. The thing to do with this information is not to become cynical about knowledge. It's to hold what feels obvious a little more loosely, including, possibly, the things in this collection that you feel certain were already right. Story 36, we only use 10% of our brains, a myth that neuroscience has disproved every way possible. The 10% brain myth is possibly the most thoroughly debunked piece of popular neuroscience, and it keeps coming back. It appears in self-help books, motivational speeches, film plots, and casual conversation as the premise for what would happen if humans could unlock the other 90%. Hence the film Lucy and Limitless, both built on the premise directly. Every line of neuroscientific evidence contradicts it. Brain imaging studies, PET scans, fMRI show that virtually all brain regions show activity across the course of a normal day, with different regions active during different tasks. No dormant 90% has ever been found sitting idle. Damage to almost any part of the brain produces some functional consequence, which would not be the case if most of it were unused backup capacity. The brain consumes approximately 20% of the body's total energy, despite comprising only 2% of its mass, an evolutionary luxury that would be inconceivable if 90% of it were expendable. The myth's origin is unclear and probably composite. William James wrote in 1907 that humans make use of only a small part of our possible mental and physical resources, which is a claim about potential, not about neural activity. Dale Carnegie may have amplified a version. Various misattributions to Einstein have circulated without basis. The specific 10% figure appears to have no clear original source. The myth persists because it is motivationally appealing. The idea that vast untapped potential sits waiting to be unlocked is a better story than your brain is already working hard, and this is roughly what you can do with it. It also provides a satisfying explanation for human limitation that doesn't require accepting limitation as real. The 90% is not waiting. The brain is using essentially all of it, all the time. Story 37, lightning never strikes the same place twice. Lightning specifically prefers to strike the same place as lightning, never strikes the same place twice, is used as a metaphor for the impossibility of identical misfortune repeating. And like many metaphors that have hardened into pseudo-facts, it is wrong about the literal phenomenon it describes. Lightning not only can strike the same place twice, lightning systematically and preferentially strikes the same places repeatedly. Lightning follows the path of least resistance from cloud to ground, and that path is determined by the physical characteristics of the ground below: height, conductivity, moisture, pointed projections. These characteristics don't change between strikes. A tall metal tower in an elevated location is a better lightning conductor than a flat grassy field, regardless of whether it has been struck before. And it will be struck again preferentially for the same reasons it was struck the first time. The Empire State Building in New York is struck by lightning approximately 20 to 25 times per year. The building was struck multiple times in a single storm, on multiple occasions during its history. It was struck 8 times in 24 minutes on one documented occasion in 2011. Its height and conductivity make it an excellent lightning conductor, and this remains true regardless of prior strike history. Lightning rods, the protective devices installed on tall structures specifically to attract and safely conduct lightning, work on exactly this principle. They are designed to be struck repeatedly, conducting each strike safely to ground. The metaphor has it precisely backwards. Lightning revisits the same places because the conditions that made those places attractive to lightning in the first place are still present. Past strikes don't immunize a location against future strikes. They don't even reduce the probability. In many cases, they leave physical traces that slightly increase conductivity and thus slightly increase future strike probability. Story 38 bulls are enraged by the color red. They are functionally red-green colorblind. The image of a matador waving a red cape to enrage a bull is so embedded in the iconography of bullfighting and so thoroughly transmitted through cartoons, idioms, and popular references that seeing red has entered English as a phrase for anger directly derived from this supposed bull behavior. The bulls cannot see red, not meaningfully. They are functionally red-green colorblind, sharing this limitation with dogs and many other mammals. Cattle, like most non-primate mammals, have dichromatic vision, 2 types of cone cells rather than the 3 that give humans and other primates trichromatic color vision. The cattle visual spectrum is shifted toward blue and yellow wavelengths. Red and green appear to cattle as similar, desaturated hues, roughly equivalent to what a human with red-green color blindness would see. A red object and a green object of similar brightness are not easily distinguished by a bull. What actually provokes the bull in a bullfighting context is not the color of the cape, but its movement. The matador's cape, whether the red muleta used in the final third of the fight or the larger magenta and yellow capote used earlier, provokes the bull by moving. Bulls, like many animals, respond strongly to moving objects and are generally not calm to begin with in the bullring, having been subject to specific provocation before the matador enters. Experiments in which bulls were presented with stationary red cloth found no particular response. Moving cloth of any color produced charging behavior. The red cape became traditional in bullfighting for various reasons, including visual effect for the human audience and the practical benefit that it conceals bloodstains. The bull's opinion of its color is that it has none. Story 39, the Great Wall of China, is visible from space. Astronauts have checked. It isn't the claim that the Great Wall of China is the only man-made structure visible from space, or from the moon, is one of the most durable geography facts in popular circulation. It appears in trivia books, school curricula, and tourist information about the wall. It is false, and it has been directly tested by the people in the best position to check. The Great Wall of China is long, approximately 21,000 kilometers if all sections, branches, and parallel walls are counted, though the more commonly cited main wall is shorter. But the wall is not wide. At its widest, it is approximately 9 meters across, and in many sections considerably narrower. Width, not length, is what determines whether a structure is visible from a distance. The human eye resolves objects at distance based on their angular size in both dimensions, and a very long but very narrow object becomes invisible long before a compact wide object of similar area. From low Earth orbit, the altitude of the International Space Station at approximately 400 kilometers, the Great Wall is not visible to the naked eye under normal conditions. This has been confirmed by multiple astronauts. Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei reported after his 2003 spaceflight that he had looked for the wall and could not see it. Other astronauts have echoed this. One astronaut, Ed Lu, has noted that with optical aids and ideal conditions, something that might be the wall has occasionally been glimpsed, but it is far from reliably visible. From the moon, approximately 384,000 kilometers away, the wall would be approximately the width of a human hair viewed from 3 kilometers. Nothing of that scale is visible from the moon without instruments. The myth appears to predate spaceflight, appearing in print as early as 1932, before anyone could test it. Once space travel made testing possible, the tests were done. The wall is not visible. Story 40. Napoleon was very short. He was average height for his era, and the myth was partly British propaganda. Napoleon Bonaparte's height is one of history's most persistent myths, and one with a fairly well-documented origin. The standard claim that Napoleon was unusually short, around 5 feet 2 inches, is wrong. Napoleon was approximately 5 feet 6 or 7 inches tall, which was average to slightly above average for a French man of his era. The confusion has a specific source: the difference between French and English measurements. Napoleon's height was recorded in French units as 5 pides 2 pouces. French pouce and English inch were not the same unit. The French pouce was slightly larger. The French measurement converts to approximately 5 feet 6-7 inches in English imperial units. British writers and cartoonists, using the numbers without the conversion, reported Napoleon as 5 feet 2 inches in English measurement. British political cartoonists, particularly James Gilray, were influential in establishing Napoleon's popular image, and their caricatures depicted him as small and temperamental. These cartoons served specific wartime propaganda purposes, reducing a military and political adversary to a comical figure. The small Napoleon became a British cultural product that spread internationally. Napoleon was also surrounded by his imperial guard, whose minimum height requirement was 5 feet 8 inches. Tall men who made anyone of average height appear short by comparison. Visitors to Napoleon's court may have formed their impressions partly from this contextual contrast. The man who controlled most of Europe was of unremarkable height. The myth that he was not served specific propaganda purposes was transmitted in a specific measurement error and became one of history's most confidently repeated biographical falsehoods.